Good evening. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Sheep Health, Vaccination, Pneumonia and Arthritis. My name's Ian McFarland and I'm one of the Sheep Connect SA team. Sheep Connect and the webinar wouldn't happen without support from the Australian Wool Innovation and the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund. And so for more information on Sheep Connect, please visit our website, follow us on Twitter and have a look at the videos on the YouTube channel. So tonight we've got two speakers. Mary Rowe from Zoetis has been involved in the sheep industry since 2008 when she joined PIRSA as an animal health officer on Eyre Peninsula. Then in 2014, she moved to Zoetis as the South Australian Territory Sales Manager for the areas north of Murray Bridge. She's got an ongoing involvement in providing information on arthritis, on-farm modelling of the cost of arthritis, and particularly on the use of vaccines for prevention. Mary and her husband also run a mixed farming operation near Mount Wedge on Eyre Peninsula. So at this time, I'll hand it over to Mary, who will talk to us about vets practice vaccination.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the introduction. Yep. So as Ian mentioned, I've been with Zoetis for quite some time now and working around South Australia, and we've also got our own sheep flock on a farm here at Mount Wedge, so I'll get a little bit of hands-on experience. In fact, we spent the weekend drenching and vaccinating our own ewes for their pre-lamb. The first slide I've just put up here with the fairly ordinary photo there front and centre of that half-leg roasted lamb on the cheesy gland. We probably all remember it hit the news in about March 2020 when someone in Sydney bought a lamb roast with a little unexpected surprise. So in thinking about vaccinations, I always start with, well, why do we vaccinate sheep? What do we want to achieve? And so I've got a range of photos there. Obviously on the top left, we've got an arthritic joint. And the photo below, another sheep or a lamb leg roast that's got a rather large cheesy gland lesion in it, an image of a sheep that's tetanus, and then some scabby mouth there on a lamb, which is actually a job that we went to a couple of years ago. And then that roast. So what are we hoping to achieve? Well, we all like to produce great lamb, but in the process we need to prevent some diseases that can have significant welfare issues for sheep, can have significant deleterious outcomes to the value of the carcass, and cause considerable on-farm losses. I wanted to start my presentation with going through what happens when we give vaccines and what the immune response is. So when we give a vaccine to an animal, we are trying to mimic the disease, and in mimicking that disease, get that animal to develop a strong immune response so that when it is challenged, it can protect itself. And on this graph, we have the antibody levels on the left-hand side of the screen with the time between doses on the bottom of the screen, and then the yellow line representing the protective antibody levels that an animal requires so that it doesn't get challenged by disease. When we give animals the first dose of vaccine, 90% of animals will develop a protective level of cover for a period of about 6 to 8 weeks. What happens then if they are not given a second dose is their immune response would taper off. In giving that second dose at about 6 to 8 weeks, we trigger that animal's immune system to treat the challenge as real and to significantly increase the amount of antibody production and sustain that antibody production for extended period of time. The level of antibody production does vary dependent on the antigen, but the ideal outcome is to get enough cover that when an animal is challenged, it won't succumb. The other thing we're trying to kick off here is active immunity in an animal. So when a lamb is born, it has an immature immune system, and that immune system continues to develop over the first few weeks of its life. How does it protect itself in those first few weeks? Well, that's where colostrum comes in, and passive immunity. So passive immunity is what the lamb derives from the colostrum, which it needs to get in the first 24 hours of life. And that passive immunity will give it about 6 to 8 weeks protection. So what we're then doing is giving the lamb its first dose of vaccine at lamb marking, and that will start to kick off its active immunity. Then at weaning, we give it a booster dose, and for some people, they may give a booster dose well prior to weaning, but about 4 to 6 weeks after that first dose, stimulating a strong immune response in the lamb. Now, things that this is particularly important for a lamb can be things like arthritis and tetanus, which can pose real challenge and losses over that lamb marking period. In terms of the ewe, we boosted them prior to lambing, so that they've got the maximum immune response and therefore putting the maximum amount of antibody possible into the colostrum to give that lamb good cover. So before we move on to the diseases we can vaccinate for, I wanted to present a few of the tips and tricks and things that we commonly get questions about. And one of them is where to vaccinate the sheep. So most vaccinations need to be subcutaneous. And if you check the pack, you'll be able to check that the vaccine that you're administering does go subcutaneous, which just means it wants to be under the skin. We've done a little bit of work vaccinating sheep with different length needles and at different sites. And the optimal site is indicated on this symbolic sheet that's got a little orange circle there on the side of the neck. And that is one of the easiest places to vaccinate a sheep. We recommend using a 1/4 inch needle. So for lambs or bare shorn sheep, you can hold your applicator at about 45-degree angle. And for full wool sheep, or even merinos, once they have about 6 months wool, you can vaccinate with a 1/4 inch needle at 90 degrees. I've found that once sheep have more than about 5 months wool, you need to part the wool and vaccinate to be sure that the needle's gone into the skin. And the other key point there is to change needles regularly. So if best practice is about once every 100 sheep, but at least every time you change a pack of vaccine over, put a new needle in. The pictures here highlight why technique is important. So 3 of these photos indicate animals that have developed a vaccination site lesion as a result of poor treatment technique. And these lesions result in trimming and therefore reduced carcass weight at point of sale. The fourth photo there, which is of the side of the sheep's face, is where an animal has been vaccinated in an inappropriate site and developed a significant lesion there that would have impacted on the animal's ability to graze. So the other reason that technique is important is we need to get treatment efficacy. They need to be subcutaneous. We're looking to reduce all forms of trimming to prevent secondary infections. So that's where technique and correct needle length, making sure you're using sharp needles is important. And the visual comment there is particularly relevant to one of the vaccines, Good Air. If that is given inappropriately, you can still get a very good immune response, but you can get quite a large lesion on the animal, which can be unsightly, particularly in stud stock. I included this next photo, which is from a abattoirs in New South Wales, and it indicates how much trimming can occur if vaccination technique is poor. So the sheep on the left-hand side has got about 5 or 6 lesions there, and then the same animal is photographed again on the right, and that animal has had a considerable amount of trim there. So we want to prevent this. We're giving vaccines to prevent losses, not to incur more. A couple of timely reminders about storage. So the vaccine needs to be stored generally between 4 and 8 degrees, so in the fridge, but pay particular attention that it doesn't get pushed right to the back of the fridge or end up in a fridge which freezes. If vaccine freezes, it needs to be replaced and not used. Most of the vaccines have a 30-day broaching claim, so check that when you use them and store them appropriately. You can see a photo of a pack of vaccine in the fridge door. Now that pack of vaccine hasn't had the draw-off tube removed, and it hasn't had the hose kinked either. So we can have foreign substances entering that bottle, and then if it is used, potentially causing adverse reactions. The packet of vaccine on the bottom, the Erivac, is just showing how much the product can settle out over a couple of days. So make sure you shake the packs up well. If you are vaccinating one day and do leave a draw-off tube connected, it is very important that you do excrete those doses before you continue vaccinating, because that product will settle out certainly within 12 hours. And clean applicators regularly. So it's tempting to not clean the applicator, but it needs to be done thoroughly. Things like the dual vaccinator can get quite hard to use if they haven't been cleaned, and it pays to take them apart, give them a good clean, warm soapy water followed by clean warm water, and then oil them with a little bit of olive oil. Actually, just a master food sauce bottle, like the picnic sauce bottles, works really well for holding that over the end of the applicator and just drawing a couple of mils of oil through those applicators, and then excrete those doses so only a film is left. A quick update on what the vaccines cover. So the main ones are Glandvac 3B12 and 6B12, depending on where you farm, will probably depend on what you use. The 6 major diseases they cover. So in the Glandvac 3B12, we have cover for pulpy kidney, tetanus and cheesy gland. And in the 6B12, we add blackleg, Black's disease and malignant edema. So we'll go through those first 3 diseases briefly, and those second 3 diseases essentially cause sudden death in most instances. I think it's always worthwhile, if you do get multiple sudden deaths, to get a vet involved, get a definitive diagnosis on why those losses occurred. And B12 is included in both the 3B12 and the 6B12 at 2 milligrams per mil. Essentially, that's there to capitalise on energy metabolisation. One of the key diseases is pulpy kidney. So pulpy kidney spores are virtually everywhere where there is sheep. They are in the environment and in the gut of healthy animals. Animals either ingest them or already have them in them, and they're triggered by sudden changes in feed. So frequently we see pulpy kidney losses when lambs are put onto grain, put out into really good stubbles, turned out into a really good cereal crops and medic-based pastures. It causes sudden death. You might go out the next day and a couple of the best lambs are dead. And it can be tricky to diagnose between, if you don't know what you're looking for, between bloat and pulpy kidney. How do we prevent pulpy kidney? Vaccination is key, and timely vaccination. So if you're anticipating weaning some lambs onto a rich either cereal crop or medic pasture or even lucerne, they need to be boosted a couple of weeks prior to being exposed to that change in diet. The key thing there is they need to have time for their immune system to start making the maximum amount of antibody before the change. And feed can change just because you've had extra sunny days or put extra fertiliser out. So consider those things. And for some producers, particularly prime lamb producers, you may need to boost the lambs even out on grass every couple of months. If they are going into a feedlot, it's worthwhile giving them that booster at least 2 weeks prior to putting them onto grain. Tetanus is a tricky one. So tetanus can cause sudden death in lambs, or you may see animals with that typical sawhorse position. It's virtually untreatable purely because of the cost of treatment and inefficacy. And lambs can get it from birth, so they can pick it up through the open umbilical cord, or they could pick it up through milsing or marking wounds. Couple more photos of cheesy gland in case that first cold photo wasn't enough. So these photos all highlight the amount of trim that is occurring in abattoirs because of a vaccine preventable disease. So it's caused by a bacterium. You get these large pus-filled abscesses occurring in the lymph nodes, and they can be either in the muscle or in the lungs or other lymph nodes throughout the body. Depending how big they are, they can cause significant amounts of trim. And what we've seen is if people have a complete vaccination program, i.e. the lamb getting a dose at marking, at weaning, and then boosters every 12 months, the infection rate is less than 3%. If we start missing vaccinations, that infection rate can run up to 30%, which is reasonably common. The other one I wanted to touch on was the erysipelas arthritis. So Andrew's going to go through this in a lot more detail, but essentially open wounds on the lamb is how the bacteria gets into them, and that can be as simple as when a newborn lamb is being cleaned up by its mother, the mother or dam can transmit the bacteria from the back of her throat via her tongue to the lamb and through the navel, and some of those lambs will actually die in the first week or two of life, particularly if there's additional risk of predation or keeping up with the twin. Once that bacterium is into the lamb, it goes around the bloodstream until it finds a joint, and once it localises in that joint, the animal doesn't have a very good chance of mounting an adequate immune response. The joint becomes inflamed and the animal can go lame. So we often see these in the lamb marking cradle, where you might see a lamb with bung knees, and interestingly, you'll see quite a few in your third or fourth draft of lambs putting them through the feedlot, where you can get animals we call roach-backed, and they've actually got arthritis in the spine, which impacts on the saleability of those animals and growth rates. So at the start of this month, we were fortunate to launch a new product, which is called Glen Eyrie 7-in-1 with B12. Glen Eyrie 7-in-1 with B12 is a combination of Glanvac 6B12 and Erievac. So it is a single 1 ml dose, and it aligns the same booster intervals as what we've been using with Glanvac. So a priming dose and then a booster dose 4 to 6 weeks later, followed by an annual booster. The beauty of it being a 1 ml dose is you can administer it through a quick shot. Scabby mouth is another disease we are actually seeing a little bit more of, perhaps because less vaccination of lambs in the cradle is occurring. It's caused by a virus and it forms pustules around the mouth and the nose. It can also form pustules on the teats of ewes, can impact their feet. And the risk with that ewes getting pustules or even newborn or young lambs picking up scabby mouth is that they can then transmit that to the dam, which may increase the likelihood of the ewe getting mastitis. It impacts the grazing, suckling and feeding of these sheep significantly. So animals that pick up scabby mouth have significantly reduced growth rates for about the 4 to 6 weeks it takes for the disease to run its course. And obviously it's out in the environment. Once a property has scabby mouth, they will have ongoing issues with that. It's not treatable, but it is preventable. The OH&S risk with it is real, so if people are handling sheep with scabby mouth, they can also pick up that virus and get lesions themselves. Feedlots are a particular place for the scabby mouth to spread and cause fairly substantial economic losses. The reason for this, if lambs are feeding in trays, the scabs will fall off into the trays and then infect other sheep. Where do sheep get it? Anywhere where they're getting abrasions to their mouth. So this can be if you're grain feeding and they're feeding off of out of troughs. Thistles and burrs, so things like saffron, are particularly good at causing some abrasion to the animal's lips and then making them more likely to pick up scabby mouth. Wet conditions, so that's where you'll see scabby mouth occurring on animals' feet, and grass seeds can all trigger those outbreaks. So it is preventable, and generally it would be given to lambs in the cradle and via a scratch vaccination, and they'll then develop a mild case, a very mild case of little pustules, and have good protection for the next 12 months. The final disease is ovonoides disease, and I mention this because with a lot of sheep coming in from WA, we have seen increased resurgence in it. So it's a bacterial disease with no known cure. When it infects the intestine of the animal, it causes thickening of the intestine wall, And as the intestine wall thickens, the animal is no longer able to absorb enough nutrients. They'll get to a point where they will start wasting quickly and then start dying. So it causes weight loss and death. The bacteria survives in the environment really well, so about 48 to 52 weeks. And this disease is usually introduced, so bringing in infected sheep. So that could be buying sheep in from interstate. It could be having somebody else's sheep on agistment on your property, or sending your sheep away on agistment. So we recommend the use of good air as part of a OJD management plan in conjunction with good fencing, pasture management, being very cautious about where you purchase sheep and rams from, and then doing some ongoing surveillance through the abattoirs as well. One key thing with good air, if you do choose to use it, it is important to administer it with a Securious applicator to prevent accidental self-injection. And my final slide is, if you are setting up a vaccination program and want to have some extra insurance that you're doing it at the right time, either contact myself or you can jump onto Farm Planner. If you Google Zoetis Farm Planner, it'll take you to a link where you can build a program, which will then email you reminders leading into key vaccination times. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Mary. A couple of questions come through. So just wondering if you can comment on this. Injecting lambs under the arm when upside down in a cradle is easier than in the neck, and they've also seen it done in the cheek of lamb in cradles. Would you like to make any comment on that?
Certainly. So the key thing with getting a good immune response is administering that product subcutaneous. So if you do give it in the cheek or under the front leg, it will work, but the likelihood of getting vaccination site lesions is increased. And if you are vaccinating into the cheek, the likelihood of there being impact on that lamb then going out and grazing does increase. So it is a little bit of a mindset change when you change the way you vaccinate, because you develop a habit and then it feels awkward when you change. Personally, we vaccinate on the side of the neck in the cradle, and once you get used to it, I feel that it is every bit as quick and easy to do as trying to tent the skin under a small lamb's leg.
Thanks, Mary. So what's the maximum time you can go between the marking vaccination and the second dose?
So after, I'll just flick back to that slide quickly. After we get that first dose, we've got about 6 to 8 weeks when the lamb has reasonable cover, and then the amount of antibody that lamb is producing tails off. If you gave that booster, let's say at 3 months, the animal would then still develop a really strong immune response to that booster vaccination, but they would have spent about 4 weeks below the protective level. So if you are giving your booster more than 4 to 6 weeks after your priming dose, just be aware that the animal is dropping below the protective level for a period of time.
Okay, thank you. Question, scabby mouth, is that a one-off, or does that require an annual booster?
So technically it's meant to be boosted every year. Most people just give it in the cradle and find that the animals then get enough environmental challenge that it will boost their response from there on. So in most instances, it would only be given to an animal once in the cradle, and then they would depend on environmental exposure to continue that sustained response.
A question around the needle length. With a 1/8 needle in a lamb, can you apply at 90 degrees in the neck?
In a lamb or an adult sheep?
In a lamb.
In a lamb, I'd recommend vaccinating on an angle, purely because a lamb's skin is quite a bit thinner than an adult sheep, and you may get some of the vaccine going into that first layer of muscle at 90 degrees. But practically with a 1/4 inch needle, 45 degrees if you can. If the odd sheep ends up being 90 degrees, it's not going to be the end of the world.
But yeah, I'd just like to thank Andrew and Mary again for their time and their insight and expertise in these areas. So thanks very much, guys. And I thank everyone for joining us tonight for the webinar. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful evening. Good night.